Well, I too want to join others in thanking you for the opportunity to be a part of this great occasion. I, like many of you, I'm sure all of you, am a big fan of William F. Buckley Jr. and his writings and have been greatly influenced by them, and it's just a great privilege for me to be a part of this. And I want to thank you also for including a state policy idea in the mix of ideas to be considered, because that's what this is that I'm going to be presenting, is an idea that comes about for state policy, and for that reason is going to be perhaps particularly well suited for certain states, more so than perhaps other states. But we'll get into that in just a minute. Harvard's Kennedy School of Government recently assembled a panel of experts to discuss ways to address an age-old phenomenon, gerrymandering, that has become increasingly sophisticated thanks to recent advances in computer software technology. At the conference, the academic dean of the Kennedy School argued that if war is too important to be left to the generals, redistricting is too important to be left to the elected politicians. And many of his colleagues made similar arguments for putting redistricting in the hands of, gosh, surprise, surprise, people much like themselves, unbiased elites who do not hold elected office and therefore can be trusted to draw lines that are fair and neutral. While no one would dispute that the redistricting process is often fraught with mischief, the Harvard panelists' profound confidence in people like themselves reminded me of the wisdom of William F. Buckley Jr.'s famous declaration, "I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston telephone directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University." That's because the best way to address the problem of gerrymandering isn't to cede more power to unelected experts who claim to be impartial. The best way to address the problem of gerrymandering is to introduce an element of random selection, akin to pulling names from a telephone directory, into the redistricting process. Allow me to explain. The term gerrymander can be traced back to an 1812 Boston Gazette cartoon criticizing a redistricting plan signed into law by Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who was, by the way, a Harvard grad. The 1812 cartoon suggested that some oddly shaped district boundaries resembled a salamander, and the pejorative name stuck. In his book, The Lexicon, William F. Buckley Jr. gave a straightforward definition of the term which we would all recognize and understand. He defined gerrymander as an electoral district carved up without regard to demographic symmetry, intending to fortify a political party at the expense of another. Interestingly, though, when Buckley went to illustrate how the term gerrymander may be used in a sentence, he suggested that one's perception of any redistricting plan often depends a great deal on whose ox is being gored or whose jerry is being mandered. Here's Buckley's illustrative sentence. The fat and rich Democratic gerrymanders are going to find a dragon waiting for them when they rev up for their decennial hanky-panky. Those interested in self-government should side with the dragon, Newt Gingrich. In essence, Buckley was acknowledging something that many of today's Harvard faculty do-gooders are slow to concede, that drawing district boundaries is an inherently and inescapably political act, even if performed by expert panels who are sincerely seeking to be impartial, nonpartisan, or unbiased. The recent experience in my home state, Florida, illustrates this point. In 2010, a coalition of progressive groups, funded in large part by George Soros, led a successful campaign to add the Fair Districts Amendment to the Florida Constitution. These amendments gave legislators 6 guidelines for drawing election districts. Don't favor incumbents, don't favor any political party, don't deny equal opportunities to minorities, don't vary district population size, don't stray from existing political and geographic boundaries, and don't divide districts or fail to make them compact. Curiously, the guidelines offered no criteria ranking beyond saying that the first 3 related to the concerns that we most often hear about gerrymandering: incumbents, political party, minorities. Those 3 matter more than the other 3, but that's as much guidance as was given. And this ambiguity made about as much sense as asking a group of school children to line up alphabetically from tallest to shortest. It also virtually guaranteed challenges to any plan that the legislature crafted. And many critics believe this was by design, since the judiciary remains the branch of Florida government most sympathetic to progressive interest. Sure enough, when the inevitable lawsuits were heard, the Supreme Court threw out the legislature's original plan and wielded extraordinary influence over the eventual plan adopted. In other words, Florida got just what many fair districts proponents wanted, which was redistricting by a panel of unbiased judicial experts with no legislative dragon to stand in the way. What's more, future redistricting battles will in all likelihood end up being fought out in the courts once again, since ambiguous rules do not lead to clear-cut legislative solutions. Is it better to draw districts to assure minority representation or to produce an even split of Republicans and Democrats? Is it better to group coastal communities together or to keep geographically diverse counties intact? No guidance here beyond the very basic, crude division of the first three criteria from the last three. Now, these questions are not unique to Florida, nor are they the only questions that arise in redistricting situations. Indeed, redistricting plans sometimes produce intra-party tensions. You can imagine these days tensions between never-Trumpers and those who are perhaps sympathetic to the president in the Republican ranks. So you see, redistricting plans sometimes produce these intra-party tensions when one member's interests are in conflict with those of other members of his party. And this is a fact that's often overlooked in some of the challenges that you see to various plans. The point then is that no redistricting plan can satisfy everyone, especially since certain regions have more Republicans than Democrats or more minorities than other regions. So every citizen can't live in a swing district, nor can any group of leaders devise a plan that perfectly balances every competing interest and consideration. Given this reality, a strong case can be made for keeping redistricting in the hands of elected officials who are accountable to the people, while reducing the potential for what Buckley called legislative hanky-panky by having legislators craft multiple redistricting plans from which one would be selected at random. Indeed, after the Supreme Court intervened in the Florida redistricting case several years ago, I suggested that in future redistricting situations, the legislature should draw up 3 to 9 plans, none of which would have the same combination of high and low preferences. So, for example, one plan might give the greatest consideration to protecting minority interests and the least to preserving county boundaries, while another might give the greatest consideration to not favoring incumbents and the least to geographic considerations or geographic compactness. Then, after these multiple plans have been drawn up using this highly sophisticated software that allows you to go and almost pick neighborhood by neighborhood, the Florida lottery would then be called upon to randomly select one of these plans out of a hat, so to speak. Obviously, adding an element of randomness would not ensure that the eventual outcome would please every legislator, interest group, or citizen. Not everyone wins in a lottery. But it would give the people a system in which they can have greater confidence. And it would do so without having the legislature abandon its constitutional duties or having the Supreme Court pretend that it knows an unbiased way to satisfy all the existing guidelines. In summary, then, the best way to address gerrymandering isn't to have judicial officials or unbiased experts from the Florida faculty, from the Harvard faculty draw new district lines. The best way to address gerrymandering is for legislative bodies to acknowledge that there are many ways to skin a cat and to use today's sophisticated computer software to draw up multiple plans from which one would be selected at random. And with that, I'll open myself to any questions that you may have about the plan or about its implications or how it might play out.
Do you identify any constitutional issues with this plan?
This would be the kind of thing that would vary depending at the state level on kind of what the rules are there, because you already have a dozen or so states that have panels of experts, so to speak, that do things. So the way the redistricting works itself out in each state is a little bit different. And so depending on the state, you could conceivably have something you would probably need in those cases. And this is part of what I like about this idea, is that it would provide an option for people who want to push back against panels in the states that have them. This would provide an option for saying, hey, we have a better idea than leaving it to you guys for and restoring legislative participation in this.
Thanks. I first have to confess that in the early 1990s, I had my hand in a few districts in New York State, and we drew some things that could have been Rorschach tests. We don't know what you'd see in them. The question that I have is from that mindset, from the political party perspective, that's always going to find the way to cheat. That's always looking for the out here. How do you define a variance between the districts? How do you ensure that they don't just submit 5 or 6 districts that are almost completely the same with a block out or a neighborhood out?
Because of the number of criteria that are in play in our state, it would be very difficult to produce 6 identical or nearly identical plans, especially if you have one plan that gives greatest consideration to the effect on parties, another plan that gives greatest consideration to the effect on incumbents, another plan that gives greatest consideration to the effect on minorities. It would be hard to have that. Now, am I naive and think somehow that we're going to no longer see political parties have an influence? No, I mean, this is a political act. I would expect a Republican-dominated legislature to have 6 plans or 9 plans that they could live with, or that would appeal to varying degrees to different members within their party, okay? But the key thing here in my mind is we are not giving absolute control to them, or for that matter, to a panel or to judges. The outcome is a little bit uncertain, and in that sense, it reminds me, of course, of Lord Acton's famous comment that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. In a certain sense, part of the problem that we're wrestling with now is who's going to have absolute power, and how can we guard against them misusing it? In some respects, this, I think, helps to curb some of the worst tendencies of absolute power that might come.
At least there's one, as I recall.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll follow you.
One Supreme Court decision that lays down certain guidelines. How does that steer this program?
I'm not sure I know the case that you're referring to.
Well, I don't.
Are U.S. Supreme Court?
Yeah, U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, I mean, you've obviously got things like, the one man, one vote, one person, one vote that are unaffected by this. You still have a responsibility to make certain that districts are of equal size, but within the constitutional framework that you're working, how do you draw the districts? This gives a lot of discretion to legislatures, but ultimately the decision ends up being one that's pulled out of a hat.
I think the decision, as I recall, lays down certain guidelines.
Well, you have that also with the Civil Rights era and Voting Rights Act, where you've got to be sensitive to how those things play out. And one of the beauties of this, in my mind, is that it takes some of the I think it helps us get to the place where we ultimately want to go when it comes to how to handle some of these tricky issues related to race and our legacy there. One of the things that's really important for people to understand is that a lot of the blowback that is currently taking place among progressives is particularly taking place among white progressives who are frustrated that in many states, particularly in the South, you've seen a kind of coalition that builds between white Republicans and black Democrats to carve up districts to their mutual benefit and often to the detriment of white progressives. And I have to say, there's a part of me that doesn't really have a lot of sympathy for this argument, because I recognize that many of the people making it are people who love to play the race card and accuse others of being deplorable. But I also recognize that we're likely that it's possible that in situations where minority interests do not come out paramount if a plan is selected, that you may end up having districts that represent a better mix of the population generally. And I suspect that that could end up paying long-term dividends in the sense that it would give greater opportunity for minority voices within the minority community, black conservatives, for example, to have a greater opportunity to form coalitions with and to make arguments that they are often slow to make today, because there would be greater incentive for that to happen. And for that matter, for a lot of Republicans to see merit in making a greater effort to build those kind of coalitions. Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, thanks. This is very interesting, and you look at what happened in California, I think it was 1980, the redistricting there, and the act of real raw judicial power with national implications. But that said, do you really, just argue with me here.
Yeah.
This really isn't a problem. Nobody really cares. And but nobody really knows that redistricting goes on, except that I'm saying that the public is idiotic, but I just don't think they do care. So is this really a problem, A? And B, why you say randomness will give confidence? I don't see the linkage there. Well, because something is random, why does that make me feel better about the outcome?
Because if I had a chance to get the plan that I most preferred, that I thought was the best, selected, rather than feeling as though the system was rigged against me, then I think you're likely to think, okay, wait a minute, these guys have been trying to weigh all of these different considerations to the best of their ability, and we can't just resort to the common complaint, which is what you hear now, which is, oh, this is all rigged, the fix was in, the party in power just did what it was going to do and didn't really consider anything else. And I think you would have potentially a greater sense of confidence. I agree with you that this is not something that is driving public opinion or something. It is primarily a battle among elites. But we who care about good governance are often at a disadvantage, it seems to me, because we come up against this kind of argument that says, oh, we can't leave it to the politicians. They have a naked self-interest. We've got to find, some cooler, impartial, unbiased minds. And, of course, they don't exist.
Now,
it's an inherently political act.
May I ask one more question? Why is this system superior to one, say, that represents the way that sometimes a mom has two children fighting over one big cake that's got to be divided into two parts? The ancient time-honored system where one child does the cutting and the other child does the first picking of the piece of cake. In other words, why is this system superior to one side submitting two plans and the other side getting to pick the plan?
I'm not sure that I would want to see. Well, I guess one thing I guess that would come to mind initially is, okay, who is the other side? We think primarily in terms of political, but is it the incumbent side versus the non-incumbent side? Is it the side that is interested in having minority representation or having more diverse districts? That would be a first problem. But even beyond that, in a state where, 75% of the people are voting for for one particular political party, I'm not sure that the other 25% ought to be in a position to make that kind of choice that you're describing. Having said that, and I don't know that I would make this argument in all settings, but certainly in this setting, in a place where we all revere William F. Buckley Jr., as the author of God and Man at Yale, I have a feeling that he would appreciate at least this part of my counter to your question, which is to say, hey, there are other ways that you could kind of do this in a random fashion. And that is to say that if you look at stories from both the Hebrew Scriptures in the book of Esther or the New Testament when the disciples need to find a replacement for Judas, in both cases we find this kind of resorting to the casting of lots as a way to choose from options that people agreed were acceptable options. And that, I think, might give us confidence as well that this isn't an abdication of responsibility so much as a recognition that there are a lot of ways that you could do this appropriately. Why don't we, at the end of the process, cast lots?
Yes. To me, your idea of submitting this to a lottery system completely foreign to me. And I was involved with redistricting at one point in my career very significantly in New York State. I would just say to you, should we make all government that way? Should we have a group of people sit around in the legislature and propose all sorts of different laws and let the people vote for, or just pick out of a lottery? I do know that there's no doubt Democrats, if they're in control, will have much to say about how redistricting is. But our whole government system is based on the fact that sometimes the Democrats are in control, sometimes Republicans are in control, and we go through these years and we see Congress change. No matter how much they've reapportioned, we still see Congress at different times come under different leadership. In the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen this. I don't think a lottery system is the way to solve this problem in any way, shape, or form.
Well, I appreciate your comment, and I agree with you. This is not a practice that I would want to see imitated in all sorts of other ways. I'm simply suggesting that when it comes to redistricting, there is a legitimate criticism that can be made that someone who has a stake in the outcome, to the degree that legislators often do, should not be given absolute power. What the left does with that argument is say, therefore, let's get an unelected panel or get judges to make the decision, and they seek in their own way to kind of rig the outcome. And all I'm simply saying is, wouldn't it be better to trust the people, trust the politicians that the people have given office to draw up the plans, but not let them have absolute power? And again, this is an idea that I suspect would be particularly appealing in places where you currently have panels, or in states where progressive interests completely dominate, that give other voices an opportunity, perhaps more so than in your particular state. It would help things an awful lot in Florida, because our system is rigged to throw things to the judicial branch, and that's not a good outcome.
Yeah, there was one right here.
Did you have a question?
I wondered if you would, is this on? Yes. Okay. Wondered if you would comment on the recent case in Pennsylvania. Hadn't some districts been drawn and then it was rejected by the courts?
Yes, and I'm not an expert on that case to be able to go into the weeds on it. I do know that one of your colleagues at the National Review quite aptly pointed out that, gee, the criticisms that we now hear from the left when Republicans are in control, we didn't hear back for all those years when Democrats were in control. And this, to me, just illustrates the fact that this is an inherently political act. We can expect political parties who are in power to want to use that power as they have. I frankly, I'm not waiting for a group of saints to come walking out to solve this, because they don't exist. At the James Madison Institute, we take a lot of notice in the fact that, Madison at the beginning, at the founding, said, look, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. The reason we have government is because men are going to use power inappropriately. So this is simply a way to push back and to say, we don't want to see too much power vested in anyone, but we especially don't want unelected folks who pretend to be impartial when we know that that doesn't or can't in some ways exist, to continue that pretense. Yes?
Question about the feasibility of this on a technical level,
Okay.
while maintaining this sort of kind of computer-generated unbiasedness. So you're sort of designing like a computer-aided design for redistricting, and when computers and humans work together to design something new, there's a feedback loop. Right? It's not just sort of set it and forget it. And this is how it just works right now in the aeronautical industry and in any industry where humans and computers are working together. So given that, how does this not sort of just devolve into sort of the people who are supposed to be on these unbiased panels working with a computer to generate a map and then presenting their outcome?
It's a great question. It's a great question. And I would be equally skeptical had I not experienced what we've experienced in Florida, which is in anticipation of some of the problems that we eventually saw thrown to the judicial branch, our legislature very wisely created a software program that they made available to average citizens and said, send us your ideas for how you would like your community to be, the lines to be drawn. And you could go online, and there was a state map, and you could play with this and carve up the map using, the aid of the technology. And it showed that this is something that's accessible anyway. In fact, the reason I first got interested in this, apart from the legislative case or the judicial case and what I saw happening that bothered me, is that I had a kid who was taking AP human geography. And I have judged in our state the history fair for a number of years and have seen how a lot of times project-based learning captures the imagination of students. And I thought, wow, we could have AP human geography students at high schools all over the state submitting ideas or plans for using this technology, learning about what they're hearing, that there is some way to make all of these things perfectly work out. It's just impossible. And that at some point you have to say, we're going to give priority to not favoring incumbents, or we're going to have to give highest priority to, political party division or whatever it may be. So the software technology is something that is accessible to average everyday citizens. They can help to submit plans. And you won't then end up with the kind of phenomenon that you're describing, which I agree would be a horrible phenomenon, where the same old people do all the work and rig the system in exactly the way they want.
We are now out of time, so let's thank.
Thanks.